hope you're doing well. My name is Anahita Sen, and I'm a co-facilitator of the M&A Stories YouTube podcast, which is brought to you by Fifth Chrome Business Insights. Welcome to Season 3. The theme of this season is culture and its impact on M&A integration. Culture is one of the biggest challenges that face an M&A integration, and this challenge couldn't get any bigger as more companies are pursuing M&A based on people and culture. That is why it is important to understand, internalize, respect, and develop a clear plan of action on how to handle culture in M&A. In this season, we will be interviewing industry leaders from across the globe to hear their stories on how they address culture in an M&A integration. So here we go with today's episode.
Hi there. Welcome to another episode of M&A Stories. My name is Anirban Sen and hope you guys are staying healthy and safe in whatever part of the world you're in. Today, we're joined by another senior practitioner who has spent considerable amount of time in this space and has experience of large companies. So ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Mark Walztoni. Hi, Mark. How are you? It's been a couple of years since we spoke last, right?
It has been.
So for our viewers and the listeners who do not know you, let's start with a brief introduction, if you can.
Certainly. So I've been involved with mergers and acquisitions for about 40 years. Probably have done over 70 integrations and due diligences combined. And it was a matter of the first one, I was an employee. I was in the HR group and I really enjoyed it. And at some point, doing it often enough, I became my vocation. And I enjoyed very much, and that's really the focus of my personal practice today. I spent the first half of my career in HR, large companies, the second part working with entrepreneurs, founders, private equity firms, and consulting firms. So now I'm doing the work I love with the people I want to work with.
Awesome. That's a great introduction. And I know that we're going to have a lot of good insights that we'll be able to learn from you in this show today. So welcome again.
Thank you.
This season, we've been talking about culture in M&A. So maybe we start with, when we talk about culture, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so to me, it means the way people in a company perform the work, but also more importantly, how they treat each other and how they treat customers and vendors. So there's academic models of culture, and there's many of them. In my view, it really comes down to the behavioral aspect of it, because to me, culture is an outcome of other things.
Right.
So for example, if you were going to say, hey, Mark, how do you do culture due diligence, or how do you ascertain culture? Some of it is, very traditional. Talk to people and ask who's successful in this environment, who's not successful in this acquisition, what are certain things that are really important that you'd like to keep, what are some of the things that you think would be a great addition from another acquirer. And then I can take that down to really, and this is a model, this is my go-to model, Arvin, is the STAR model, Jay Galbraith's model.
Right.
Because it provides a focus to answering that question about culture
right
within an organization. And I want to stress here that in thinking about culture, it's often what's the culture of the target company.
Correct.
But to really get culture right, and I know you've done a lot of work in this area too, so I'm interested in your opinions as well. It's also being sure that the culture of the acquirer is well known, and if it's already in place, what the target culture is.
Right.
So I'm putting a lot into the question, so we hopefully have a lot of food to travel here.
Yeah.
But I'll stop at this point and see if there's anything in that mix you like to pull out first.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I love the fact that you mentioned about Galbraith's STAR model, because literally majority of the companies, what we've seen is they kind of struggle with culture because they try and address the values. Let me cite an example. This was a few months back. I was in I think it was a podcast that I listened to, and this lady was talking about, hey, how we got to interact with the target leadership, and this all boiled down to how good the interactions were. And it
That's
kind
right.
of reminded me an episode many years back where a company had just walked away because they didn't like the table manners
Mm,
leader of the acquiring company. And I was like, isn't that a bit vanity approach that you take when it comes to culture? And that's where we started our own research. But then when you mentioned about the star model, we
right.
see that it's the underlying structures, it's the strategic
Mm.
capabilities, it's the people that make up the culture and the outcome, the what culture is. So that's a great start.
Yeah, so I'll just follow up on your examples with a couple of my own.
Sure.
And this is intentional culture acquisition. Now
Right.
that may be a different kind of a term. So I have an example of um, the acquirer was a Nordic company, very strong intellectual property, very consensus driven. The company they were looking to acquire was based in Texas.
Wow.
So if they went out to dinner together,
Right.
one would probably, they would order different things and what they would talk about might be different. But in this case, it was intentional. The CEO's view was we have great intellectual property. We always try to get things 99% right before we go to market,
Right.
but we're not going to succeed because if minimally valuable product is 80%, and then we go out and test it
Right.
because of our culture, and in a room, say 12 out of 12 individuals have to agree, we're always going to have great RP, but we're not going to be able to scale in the company. So the Texas company, on the other hand, was all about business development. They didn't do much intellectual property, but they talked to potential clients.
Right.
So the intentional culture acquisition was, and I think this would fall in the best of both, was we want to, even though we're different, we're going to, 1 + 1 is going to equal 3 in this environment
Right.
because we need Texas. We need
Right.
something to sell.
Right.
Okay. Nordic, we have something to sell, but it's just not our nature,
Sure.
to be proud or to claim it in that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was an example of intentionality. I'd say another one was a large merger of banks in a geographical location, also in the Southwest. The initial assumption was, well, they're in the same market, they serve the same customers. Now we just have a broader geography, additional services, and it's really going to be great for everyone. So one of the strategies we used was to create an integration management office,
Right.
create work teams. And on the work teams, 2 of the people on the team were from the acquirer and 2 were from the acquired company. So the original strategy was we'll give them some chance to work together, preparing for day one. So what we found was a difference in culture of the acquirer was very collaborative and not afraid to say, we need to stop because this isn't going right.
Sure.
What we found with the other bank is that, and I'll go back to the STAR model on structure.
Yeah.
The chief executive had 20 direct reports. Their authority level was $5,000.
Right.
And which was the complete opposite,
Right.
but it was that strong control model. And what
Sure.
that bred was complacency.
Mm-hmm.
So for that group, what we found is from the acquired bank, a third of the management team was terrified about being accountable.
Right.
There
Yep.
was something about letting the boss decide that made things easier. There was another third that was, we're liberated.
Right.
Now we can really do what we need to be done. And this is the greatest thing that ever happened. And, as you would think, in the middle was, I'm not sure yet. What is this going to be like? I don't believe it. One or two of the areas. So I think sometimes culture creeps up on you.
Yes.
Because operationally the banks could come together, but if some of the culture issues didn't come out in the integration management office, the culture clash would have happened starting day one. So just a couple of examples where you can look at culture and say, okay, we're going to feature it, right? We're going to look for it. And then the other is, it's not a big deal, but then they found out it was a big deal. And fortunately, they found out about it in time.
Right, right. Another aspect of culture that I see often organizations make mistake is around treating culture almost in isolation or independent of
Mm,
the business results, right? So it's like we need to integrate the cultures, but then not look at what's going to be the financial impact, whether that's going to generate more revenue or it's going to be cost productive. And then all
yeah,
of a sudden, it's like a feel-good project that people try to do, versus when
yeah,
you actually attach it to a business outcome,
yeah.
it can become a lot more accountable initiative. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, very similar. So let's take the term employee experience.
Right,
Now, you could make a general statement and say, well, that's about employees feeling comfortable and ideally giving discretionary effort because they buy into the why of the firm and things like that. But in my experience, the pain of the pain of the change needs to be less than the pain of the status quo.
right. Yep.
Meaning that having people be happy is really not going to be effective, because if they're happy, the status quo won't change.
Right.
And often in a merger, if it's a standalone merger, well, the only ones that need to change are the CEO or the CFO, because they're reporting results and being reviewed at that level.
Sure.
But in a full integration, it is going to affect everyone. I think it's more important to be very honest about what's changing, what's not changing, what's changing when, and how it's changing. And this goes back to the banking example, I think, and individual authority, individual accountability. These are some of the factors in culture that, where if you're doing due diligence or you're aligning the culture as
Right.
opposed to creating a culture. Cultures are already there. If
Correct.
you're realigning the culture, it should be to the strategies, and then that tumbles out in how leaders are selected, the organizational structure, the processes, pay practices, etc. And maybe this is another example, Arvin, here that may be helpful. And this was a medical device manufacturer acquiring a similar company in their industry. They both
Sure.
marketed to the same customers.
Right.
The key was revenue synergy. The
Right.
sales force had to work. So as we dug into the rewards section, we found one of the companies, they felt there was a 15, 16-month sales cycle.
Right.
And the other company thought it was a 30 to 45-day sales cycle.
Wow.
Same customers.
Sure.
So what a difference in terms of
Exactly.
expectations and all those elements. So that's another example to me, of how looking at how people are rewarded
Exactly. Exactly.
and the notion of success. I have a great relationship. Haven't sold anything for 24 months, but
Sure.
it's coming, boss.
Yes,
You
I
know,
know. I know.
versus I may not be everyone's favorite, but I'm not selling myself as much as what this product can do for them. And if I'm communicating that correctly, and of course I'm abbreviating here, I'm gonna be successful.
Right, right. No, I mean that's a great example. The long cycle, long sales cycle versus short sales cycle, and that can be so challenging. I don't want to say difficult because it isn't difficult if you follow the right processes and the right way approaches, but it can
Yeah.
be challenging if you do not address them. Yeah, that's a great example. So you
Yeah.
obviously have spent a large number of years in this industry or in this space of M&A and integration.
Yeah.
But obviously, you were not born with all the intellectual understanding and expertise from day one, right? So, and
Yeah.
this is something I spoke about that let's talk about a story, So maybe we
Sure.
start from one of your early experience of culture. So
Yeah.
let's start there.
Well, actually, I'll go back to early in my career, and I was probably like most people. The first phase of the career is trying to master the foundations,
Right,
and in a sense, almost as a craftsperson model, you work to perfect your craft.
right,
And I remember early on in my first few integrations, um, and sometimes at other points, I don't always learn that quickly, was about if I only have the right tools and I follow the right tools and processes, I'll get the result.
right.
Yeah. However, and this is especially true with culture, it's not about the best tools. It's also really understanding people's values and the things that they might be giving up or getting or going through transition. So it wasn't a matter of, I can, in due diligence, I can create this perfect model because as the saying goes, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Right.
Well, due diligence doesn't often survive full first contact with integration.
Correct.
So I think my view and my scope became more nuanced over my career
Sure.
to really understand. Now, you probably noticed it's a little blurred, but I have some paintings here behind me.
Right.
So my hobby is restoring or cleaning oil paintings from the 19th, 18th century. It's kind of a niche. So, but why do I like it? It's not unlike M&A in a sense
Right.
that it's about removing the obstacles to seeing things clearly,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Maybe dirt and smoke that's baked on there over the years.
Right.
It might be something where it's gotten a little shaved over time and it needs to be put in.
Touched. Yeah.
Um, so I actually see that a little bit like my work in culture.
Sure.
It's really um, cultural mining, if you will, or reality mining.
Right.
That my integration plan may be perfect, but if I don't know that the leadership team um, isn't experienced with taking accountability
Yeah.
and leading, they tend to look toward the corner office,
Right.
then there can be a failure. And I would just add another point here in culture, and I don't know if you see this from your perspective as
Sure.
well.
Sure.
Culture can sometimes be the default answer to why the merger was unsuccessful. Well,
Yep.
cultural problems.
Yeah.
And I think because unless you're really someone defines culture, and I use the STAR model, I know you use promise.
Yeah.
Um, that can be an easy way to say, well, the culture did it,
Right.
right?
Right.
But with a little more rigor,
Yeah.
with methodology, but also just the things you learn as you get you have more experience and you can see patterns and look around corners and pick your cliche.
Sure.
That's I think where the uh, where the magic happens, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And the example that you mentioned about um, learning or mastering the craft of tools and templates, and then the realization that it's all about people, right? It's the people interaction,
Absolutely.
it's the way they behave, the values that they have. Do you recall some of the incidents that happened that kind of prompted you to start thinking along those lines, compared to, hey, you know what, here's the structure, here are the tools, just follow it, which a lot of the M&A practitioners in their initial days end up doing. It's like Excel spreadsheet, tick, 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 and then
Right.
we're done. Yeah.
Yeah. Failure is a great teacher.
Right.
And uh, in and I think this is the value of the after action reviews and lessons learned, which I always try to build into any project, so you can change course or change navigation at any point. Was looking at a plan in all its magnificence, right?
Right.
And inside that plan is someone, or not someone, a group of people
Yeah.
who are in pain, right?
Yeah.
They've lost something's changing. It
Right.
may even be better long term, but all they see right now is loss.
Is the loss. Yeah.
There's a transition to get to that new beginning. And of course, I'm kind of quoting William Bridges's
Yeah. I was just
transition
going to say.
model here.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I had
Yeah.
a chance to actually be certified in it with William Bridges. And anyway, it's certainly a leader. And then seeing that gap, the plan was perfect,
Right.
but the outcome wasn't there. So why is that? And that's because, there's a human heart inside that structure. And that to me was, I think, a real revelation, and I think a growth thing for me too, as well, because
Sure.
I was hitting the point in my career
Right.
where I was also moving to individual craft, to now coaching and mentoring others and working on building a practice and all those other types of things. So I would say failure is a great teacher, and especially if you can say in good conscience, I did everything right and it still failed.
It failed. Yeah.
Ergo, there's another factor here,
Correct.
right? I did X to get Y and I got Z. So what was the difference? What was that Z? And it is the people card. And I think it's also the mission of the organization. It's a different
Sure.
culture managing a nuclear power plant
Right.
than bringing a new technology to market.
Right. Right.
So
These
there
aren't
isn't
the- Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So, and I think I also learned that culture is not good or bad. It's situation and outcome. Does it delay or derail
Yes.
achieving the strategy and the outcome? Well, then realignment is necessary, as
Yeah.
opposed to, boy, if everyone had the same culture, life would be beautiful. No. People might feel good for a period of time,
Yeah.
but that's a road that leads to ruin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad that not a lot of nuclear companies or nuclear industry companies are into M&A, because that would be potential disaster. But
Yeah, that's where empowerment, you'd want to have a break on empowerment.
exactly. You mentioned Galbraith's star model a couple of times, and I know that some viewers and listeners would be curious to hear what that model is, and how and where can it be used for culture.
Yeah, so it's really, I look at it as a systems approach
Right.
to an enterprise, and it's also a way to look at growth and look at alignment, and it as a result of looking at that, that's where culture becomes the outcome of that well-designed system. So
Right.
just to talk through some of those, and I know this has influenced your thinking as well. So I'd really love to learn more from your perspective, but
Sure.
certainly strategy and capabilities. And one of the things I do often now, didn't do in the past, is a change readiness analysis that looks at capabilities
Very
And
important.
that's a matter of what's been done before, change magnitude, capabilities of the individuals that are leading the change, and how change gets led through the organization. I didn't focus on middle managers being an essential change agent 20 years ago. I didn't
Right.
focus on identifying key influencers through a form of network analysis
Yeah.
and using that to test the messages and provide ongoing feedback. So the capabilities piece is really critical, and that's up front with the strategy. Is the strategy just keep the engine rolling, or is it to transform it? Is it a standalone, or is it a full integration where employee adoption is critical?
Right.
And that's actually in the change readiness, for this change to be successful. So let's take the sales and revenue dimensions, revenue synergies. For that to be successful, how much of that is based on people doing something differently?
Right.
Well, at least 50% for the sales force that's not doing it that way. But even for the combined sales force, the capabilities will be changing. So that goes to the structure and how the workers perform, the processes, how decisions are made, accountability falls into that. And then the rewards, rewarding someone on the hunter model,
Right.
you eat what you kill and you get a commission within 30 days is different from you get a base salary of, say, 100,000 US because you're expected to build a relationship over 15 to 18 months.
Correct. Yeah.
Drives totally different behaviors. And then the skill piece and the talent piece, which we could spend a separate session on, certainly.
Sure.
But again, it's working back of all these steps go in order.
Yes.
So you don't identify people skills until you work through strategy, structure, processes, and then what it is you want to reward. So how does that land with you? And I know, again, on your promise model, there's
Sure.
some of the things there about professional development and management systems and things.
Yeah, I mean, so when we compare, and obviously, Promise as a model has been, we've taken inspiration from Galbraith's STAR model, McKinsey's OHI,
Sure.
and then also looked at a model that Nitin Kumar had developed for FTI, or at least he was involved with. So these are the models that kind of influenced, and there are a couple of other models as well, but largely to the point, rewards and recognition was one area where we saw that was one of the main factors that created cultural issues, differences, because
Sure.
as you know, many of the acquisitions are not really mergers, but they're acquisitions where the acquired company, the target company, is often 5 to 20 times smaller than your size, right? And you're likely to be focused a lot more on profitability and on stability of your organization, whereas the company that you acquired is likely to be scaling up. They have been, for them, it was all about market share and revenue, and it was very directional. So we would find that rewards and recognition mechanisms followed in some of the smaller companies was very different. It was not unusual to see a month employee of the month or employee of the week, but in larger companies, those rewards don't exist. You're given management rewards, and then the bonuses. Again, and there is a reason why only large companies can afford the long cycle sales compared to some of the smaller companies. They just can't afford it, right? And that's where the cultural differences come in, and which is what the R of the promise is. Rewards and recognition. We also saw that when it comes to consequences, smaller companies would take a softer approach with warnings of reprimanding people, whereas larger companies would have much more strict on policies and procedures, which adherence to them would essentially define whether you get let off with a warning or you get fired for the compliance issue that you created. So So yeah, so again, explaining like professional development, that was another thing.
Yeah.
It kind of there was this particular integration that I was involved with a few years back. I found that the CEO was struggling, and CEO came from a small company comparatively. He struggled in the large company setup, and
Yeah.
one day he came in and said, we were a company known for our innovation. Okay, that's
Hmm.
why they acquired us. But somehow,
Right.
um, ever since we got acquired, we've not been able to get even a single approval on any of the
Hmm.
ideas that we've come up with. And I know that
Right.
these ideas had similar, let's say, opportunity or potential if they had been accepted, but never never could get accepted by the leadership team. And then I started uh, drilling into it. What I found was very interesting and a great learning opportunity for me was because I asked the guys on the acquired side, the acquirer company, and they said these guys don't know how to explain an idea to the management,
Mm.
right? Because and then it kind of dawned on me, the penny dropped. It's like they do not have the professional presentation skills that are often required to grow in large companies, the corporate savviness, the corporate
Right.
culture, the ability to present your ideas, PowerPoint jockeys. That was another thing. So professional development was part of that. Yeah. So I mean, these are just the two aspects of promise, and there's a completely another episode where I shared. But yeah, I mean, we have taken inspiration from Galbraith's, and
Hmm.
one area where it probably got covered under people in the
Hmm.
Galbraith's model, but it was probably too broad, which was
Mm.
innovation and critical thinking. And
Right.
this got influence, which is the eye of the promise, where we found is that, and this is a model that is used in education, rubrics model, right? Rubric
Hmm.
essentially talks about you first get trained on a skill, then you
Right.
apply it on a skill, and then when you are in a position that you can actually communicate the knowledge, the expertise to others, you attain a different level, right? The way you
Yes.
mentioned, you first master the craft, then you are able to mentor, coach the others.
Hmm.
And then comes a stage when you're actually able to critique your skill or the area that you learned, right? So this is where
Right.
innovation and critical thinking comes in. So this is something where we found that we probably needed to call it out separately and
Mm.
say that this, especially because when in today's day and age, when we're looking at a lot more IP centric, people centric acquisition, the innovation and
Right.
critical thinking is crucial for that consideration. So, yeah,
Yeah. And, something too that I think to the
sure.
strategy piece and the capability is the business model
Yeah,
of the organization. So, um, I recently did or was involved with a large, well, it was $1 billion acquisition. It was business services, and the purpose of it was geographical reach, and to some smaller extent, adding new services. And again, on paper, it looked, well, what could go wrong, right?
sure.
But in professional services, business services, um, sometimes there's project work,
Yep.
and sometimes it's time and materials. So project work may be fixed fee, maybe minimum fee with incentives. But the mentality or the way people view their work, if it's time and materials, is different than if they view it as a project.
Right.
So that was one of the clashes on the reward. For time and materials, it was, well, we can't go over 40 hours. I'm just doing my time. Someone else has to do this. And my intent is not good or bad, because
Sure.
there's been a tremendous amount of companies that have used time and materials to create billion-dollar organizations,
Right.
but then they merge into project organizations.
Right.
And from a skills development and leadership development perspective, earlier in my career, I joined a technology services company. The founder and a partner basically built it on their kitchen table into a $300 million organization. And it was all time and materials.
Right.
And they wanted to get into project work because of the margins and because they had great relationships with customers, large customers, who would ask them, hey, can you do this project, or can you help us put in this ERP? And it was like, well, we can staff it, but we can't manage it.
Right.
So that's where, when I came in, it was to essentially create their learning and development and HR function.
Right.
Because if you're hiring project people, it's different compensation, it's different skill set. And guess what? They want development. It's an expectation. And career paths. So
Right.
that, again, this is where, if you're looking at the Galbraith model, strategy and capabilities are the first step. I think that's where they really come together.
Correct. And so the S in the promise is strategy, future strategy, or strategic future, right? And
yeah,
and we, because without strategy, without the future, and we actually have defined it into three sort of layers, right? So you have the strategy, which is kind of the North Star, the visionary approach, right? Then it needs to be translated into what does it mean from a capabilities perspective. And some of the models that we talk about are blue ocean strategy, right? In blue ocean strategy, in order to gain competitive advantage, people talk about what are the pieces by which companies compete in a certain sector, right? This could be pricing, this could be service delivery, this could be the power of their distributors network, this could be the quality of product, this could be what customer does. So there are those 8 or 10 parameters on the basis of which blue ocean strategy that approach works, right? And we were like, yep, that's exactly what, in a lot of other companies, they'll call it capabilities. So let me give you an example, right? Amazon uses dynamic pricing in their e-commerce model, which makes it an extremely successful company. Apart from the others, there are other factors, right? But the fact that we can do dynamic pricing, it's a capability that they developed over a period of time, right?
Well, I think my plumber uses dynamic pricing, because when there's water in the basement,
there you
what
go.
he charges goes up.
Exactly. But then your plumber has that capability of being able to use dynamic pricing, because there are other places it just does not matter. Like in Netherlands, where in the past it used to be you call up the plumber comes in. Doesn't matter whether it's a 5-minute job or a 50-minute job or an hour job, they will give you a receipt of an hour or 2 hours, whatever number of the time and material thing, right? So so strategy and capability have to be the starting point, right? And this is, once you've defined the strategy and then the capability, that's when you can start talking about the structures that are going to create the culture that you need. So
and something along that too, and it isn't explicit in the model, is communications. And I've certainly found that over my career. And when I'm talking about communications, I'm including employee, customer, and vendor. And communication plans, event calendars, working with leaders, what to say, what not to say, key points to be reinforced, and that the rule of tell them 6 times in 6 ways what they need to know. And the corollary is when you're tired of saying it is when they're starting to hear it. And I think communication certainly is a tremendous driver. And so a lot of my work, frankly, has been in merger repair. And the merger repair was, we didn't tell them very much because we didn't want them to worry. So they made up their own story. Employees make up the story. Customers make up the story. Headhunters communicate the story. Competitors communicate the story. And to me, that's an area as M&A professionals that is really worth calling out.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on communication, right? And it did come up in our evolution of discussion as well. And what we found, especially the communication to the customers or the communication to the vendors, was that tone was usually set by the leadership team. And
Right.
that's where, when we talk about the organizational hierarchy and leadership styles, that's where we say, because we struggled with having communication on its own because it was too big. It was every interaction, every message that went out.
Right.
And then it kind of dawned on us, it's actually the tone gets set by the leadership team,
Sure.
and that's where we said it's probably an outcome. The communication is an outcome of the leadership styles. And if you need to change the communication styles, I mean, obviously you'll work on the management system, etc. But you need to start again with the leaders on what sort of communication do they want to drive. So, but it's a very, very important point in culture.
And I mentioned middle managers a little bit earlier too,
Yes.
and that's been another key learning is that when you talk about the leadership, if the middle manager is saying something different because they're not included in the communication process, the first time that happens, where one, the leadership message is, we value your input. Someone goes to the middle manager and the middle manager says, I'll tell you what you need to know when it's time to know. Well, then now you have a recovery problem and you have a resistance problem primarily. So I completely agree with you. And again, that's been one of my lessons learned is the definition of leader or even change leader drills down deeper in the organization than it would with something outside of the high stakes nature of a merger and acquisition integration.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also called out network analysis, organization network analysis, analysis of influences in an organization. And I know that this is a very, very important area, again, when it comes to culture. For our viewers and listeners, if you can elaborate a bit more on the ONA side of things.
Yeah, so the formal element of it, of course, is identifying connections and interaction points, nexus points. For example, if there is someone, say, who's in the tax department, their spread may be very limited. That may connect to their bosses in their network. Maybe they have a subordinate, as opposed to someone like a COO who has a number of points. Now, there's a formal process to do that. I sometimes use in my stakeholder interviews, I'll ask them, who are the employees that people go to when they have a question?
Sure.
Oh, they go to John, they go to Mary.
Yeah.
And it's almost a frequency or a mental frequency analysis, right? If I hear John and Mary 10 times out of 15, well, I'm going to assume that John and Mary are someone I need to bring into the tent.
Correct.
To listen to the messages, to de-jargon the messages, to provide feedback. So there's organizations that make their money with a formal process to map this out.
Sure.
I often find resistance to that, so there's the workaround. Sure. And it's the informal network analysis. And actually, that's why sometimes too, and this goes back to, the notion of artifacts. If you're doing cultural due diligence, you look at written communications from the past. What did it look like in their last merger and acquisition, or when they launched their ERP initiative? And you can look at, if you have a question, call the CEO, and it's a 5,000 person company.
Right.
Well, that's one level, as opposed to, talk to your supervisor. Well, great. So how did you train the supervisor?
Right.
Well, we didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Major disconnect. Well, we gave them a communication guide. We gave them the key messages, and they were involved with screening. Because I think where the battle is really won is on the front lines. Sometimes I've seen middle managers, and the new term would be frontline leaders. I think they're both
Right.
valuable. They're the point, the nexus point
Yeah.
between the employees, especially when adoption is critical and retention is critical.
Right. Right. So now I was just looking at the watch, and when you're having a good conversation, it is it just time just flies.
It does.
Yeah. So on the challenges itself, and you've been involved in this space for many years. What are
Yeah.
some of the changes that you see, and some of the changes that are positive changes and that you like, that people are getting more involved in this space, but on the other side, some of the changes that you'd like to see more changes in, or people to think differently. So maybe just give us a flavor of positive as well as changes that need change.
Specifically regarding culture
Regarding culture in M&A, yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that the term culture, when I first got involved with M&A, was a head nodder. And by that, I mean, oh yeah, culture is important.
Right.
Then it went to, why should we care about culture?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. And then it changed to, culture is important, but we don't know how to put our hands around it, because it's, the first question is always, how do you define culture? That's a bad, that's not like, how do you define ROI, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then it went into the phase of, oh, culture is critical. How do I address it?
Right.
And where I see it now and where I think it belongs
Sure.
is the notion of it isn't a separate work stream. Let's fix the culture or align it. It's really the organization alignment piece. And I don't think it's simple, but it's difficult when you have the models can be simple. So I'm giving you a long answer, but I've seen it go from being irrelevant, not defined, to now what do we do? I think there's a risk in trying to focus on culture alone. Let's get let's give it to HR, right? Or I've seen it work. Let's give it to the integration management office or the project management office, because it's something that is not an individual work stream. It's something that group should be concerned about.
Sure.
So I think it's really been the trajectory of how culture has been addressed or non-addressed.
Yeah.
I feel it's in a good place now, in the sense of I see it's not being pulled out and isolated,
right,
and then delegated to a group. But it's become more mainstream. So
yeah,
the risk, I believe, with culture is it isn't like you declare victory and move on to something else after 60 days after day one.
right.
It's a commitment. It's a long-term commitment.
Correct.
It's kind of the notion that values change and may never change. Attitudes may change in 2 or 3 years. Behaviors could change in the next 5 minutes.
Right.
But it may not be sustainable. It may be sustainable during this first 60 days, and then we go back to the old way.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the key, the culture itself as a concept is not a merger and integration to do that you declare victory on and you're done. It has to stay with the organization for it to really have the effect you need in reaching the deal goals and achieving the deal strategies.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that you brought up the sustainability part because, as you know, we conduct these researches, right? So the last research was a cultural impact, and we had a section on sustainability. That was unfortunately the
Mm,
most poorly scored because everybody, or almost everybody, I don't want to say everybody, but a large number of people said, you know what? It's the thing that you talked about. It's the behavior. People will change their behavior for 5 minutes, and then if you do not change I like the way you put it, the values, the
mhm.
artifacts, the values, and the what was it
Attitudes, yeah.
again? What's that?
Oh, the attitudes, values, attitudes, and behaviors.
Yeah, values,
Yeah.
attitudes, behaviors, right? So I'm probably going to use it in the report out for the research, but yeah, it totally makes sense. Behaviors for 5 minutes, but if you want to have it long term, then you need to address the attitude. In order to get the attitude, you probably need to look at the underlying structures and factors. But no, this has been brilliant. I know we spoke about Galbraith, and as I said, I was looking at the watch. We're almost closing on to the hour
Sure.
time. Um, are there some other tools, techniques, templates, or websites that you go to refer for reference, books that you cite often? Obviously for the viewers and listeners, we're going to include the details in our show notes. But yeah, if you could share a few.
Yeah. So Galbraith, I think William Bridges is timeless.
Yes.
And because often what people perceive they're giving up would be cultural factors.
Right.
They're giving up they're giving up their facility, for example. So it's helpful to take that lens because I've certainly seen the CEO standing up and saying, "Let me describe the city on a hill,"
Right.
which is the new beginning before that. So I think Bridges is very good. Where I've put a lot of effort, and this comes from a lot of locations, is I want to be better at asking the right questions.
Right.
And certainly there's a I uh, another source is Clint Kendrick, who's the chairperson of the HR Roundtable,
Yeah.
and I've um, I've spoken at their annual conferences for the last 3 years, and at one point was on the conference steering committee. And he is very sound and very attuned, and he has a book about culture due diligence. And I think you and I would agree that um, due diligence has to be connected to integration. That's where integration planning starts, is in due
Correct.
diligence. I think he's done some tremendous work there.
Exactly.
And then the other part, and this is maybe a little non-traditional, is I've been thinking a lot about virtues lately, because virtues, if you go back in history, virtues have been thousands and thousands of years, right? So it's not a matter of, well, let's find a new cultural factor and that's it.
Sure.
Some of the things about prudence and fortitude, and that I think are really timeless. So what I've been thinking about is, are there some lessons from the past that could be pulled forward, or ways to ask better questions to understand culture from that perspective? So, Arvind, it's a work in progress, but that I would say is where it gets me excited as I'm going from the craftsman to to the vocation.
Sure.
Frankly, to see a context beyond M&A into the whole leadership area and organizational capabilities. So we'll see where that goes. But there does, the present is reflected in the history of the past. So that's something that's an interest of mine right now.
Yeah, and we absolutely look forward to hearing more on virtue. I think that's you're onto something there, because virtue, I believe, is something that's a lot more long term, people have virtues that they develop, which they don't necessarily lose. Values you could still change in a lifetime.
Sure.
Virtues are ones that kind of stay on with you almost forever. So that's a good one. I know we're coming to the end of the session here, but one last question.
Sure.
What if you were to advise yourself, the self that you had when you started your career, and what should you tell that person?
I remember that guy, actually.
Yeah.
I remember he had a little more hair and that, but gosh, so this is message to myself as a
Starting out,
say in my 20s. Yeah.
yes.
Maybe this will touch to the virtue thing is the humility to listen.
Right.
I think when I was all about the craft, there was also a competitive nature to that and pride nature to it. And I think that I worked for a CEO once who said that he was the smartest person in the room.
Right.
At all times.
Mm-hmm.
And he was probably 99% of the time. But the lesson on that, or I should say the downside, the overused strength, is he lost 50% of the commitment from everyone in the room.
Sure.
Because he would always be improving everything.
Yeah.
So I was never the smartest person in the room, but there were times when I probably thought I was. And if I could go back, I would say find others that you can really learn from.
Yes.
It's not about competition. Everyone can win. And you can't pour tea into a full cup, so the moment you think you know it all is the moment you've cut yourself off to learning.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's a great way to also bring closure to the episode today. Mark, it was such a pleasure. Lots of things I learned.
Thank you, the same.
Yeah. So thank you again. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for inviting me. Bye.
Bye.
Did you like today's content? If yes, then don't forget to hit the like button. If you heard something interesting, then don't forget to share it with your network and friends. And last but not least, please support us on this journey to spread awareness on topics related to M&A and integration by subscribing to our channel. That's all for now. Stay healthy and see you next time.
And if you like this session, I'm sure you'll also like our latest new tool. It is a quick assessment scorecard to assess the robustness of your culture integration capabilities in M&A. It just takes less than 5 minutes to answer. It is for free and you get instantaneous assessment. So visit culturema.scoreapp.com. That's culturema.scoreapp.com and find out for yourself.
I hope you guys enjoyed the show today. This show was sponsored by Fifth Chrome, a business strategy advisor in a training company specializing in M&A, post-merger integration, and business strategy.